When you look at the operation of a power system, one of the most fundamental enablers and drivers of system flexibility is the transmission system. The New York State transmission system has not seen much change over the last 30 years, but the generation fleet has. So when you start thinking about all of the new assets, all of the new renewables, the wind that are coming onto the system, they're all being located in the northern part of the state. Most of the high impact load and certainly any of the growth to load we've seen is in the downstate region. So as you start thinking about how you're going to change this system, displace that high emitting fossil fuel set of resources that are downstate, you've got to be able to move that power from across the state. And the transmission infrastructure, having a reliable and high performing transmission infrastructure is going to be so critically important. We're very, very happy that we've been able to use some of the FERC Order 1000 processes, working in partnership with New York State to start significant, meaningful transmission upgrades in western New York and through the Mohawk River Valley and down the Hudson River Valley. So that's a great start, and that's going to enable us to make some tremendous progress towards achieving these goals. But we can't stop there. We've got other infrastructure. We've got to think about the amount of offshore wind that's going to be built. And that's going to be very, very valuable towards offsetting some of that load in the city. But New York City doesn't have a lot of interconnection points, so we got to think about how we get that power from offshore into the load pockets in New York City. And then continually, we got to start thinking about that onshore wind that's largely going to be built upstate, and how do we get that across state and down into New York City. Those are going to be very, very critical corridors to be able to move the power, and we need to keep the foot on the pedal of transmission infrastructure and upgrading our infrastructure, because it's the transmission infrastructure that really gives us the flexibility to make those operating decisions in day. And when we have more flexibility in day, then we've got more tools at our disposal to maintain reliability. Some of the changes I think that we need to think about for the future is in lockstep with how the industry is changing. So very much you're seeing an industry where you have a power grid which has a lot of large central generating stations. And you're starting to see the introduction of a lot of those smaller resources, whether it's behind the meter solar, whether it's distributed energy resources, whether it's the introduction of more batteries, some hybrid configurations where you've got a solar panel and a battery operating together on one electric node and contributing to the market in a hybrid fashion. So as the industry changes, we got to start thinking about how we interact with more customers. And some of these customers are new. We're going to have to think about what the smaller entities are going to need. And so that's going to require a little bit more customer touch, a little bit more customer reach, and then the ability to manage what is a very, very dynamic and rapidly changing resource base. Energy storage represents tremendous value to the electric grid. The ability to charge a battery when prices are low and when the amount of renewable resources are plentiful, and then have that available for later in the day or at a later time period is just going to be tremendous from a reliability standpoint, because it gives us more options, more tools to be able to leverage when it's needed. It's also going to be very, very economic in terms of being able to capture the differences in prices that we see through the course of the day. So for consumers, it's going to be good. And from the standpoint of being able to maximize the amount of renewables we can put on the system, batteries are going to be really valuable, because there's periods of time when there's a lot more wind energy than we need. And there's going to be periods of time into the future when there's a lot more renewables than we need at that point in time. So the ability to capture that and save that for a point in time later, when the wind isn't blowing, is going to be a tremendous asset to be able to get us that much closer and increase the likelihood that we're going to achieve these renewable targets. The performance profile of offshore wind is dramatically different than what we see with the onshore wind assets that we have today. And those differences represent real reliability value for the system. The offshore wind is projected, and we're planning on it being available more frequently, so at a higher capacity factor. So those instances of time where the wind isn't blowing that we experience onshore, it's a much dramatically different wind profile offshore. So it's going to be a more reliable asset. It's also the way that the offshore wind patterns the way offshore wind patterns are projected to perform are much more in line with our consumption patterns. So where onshore wind performs much better at night when our loads are low and not quite as well during the day when loads are high, the offshore wind is going to have that consistent pattern where during the peak times of the day we anticipate getting better performance out of them. So I'm very, very pleased to see the commitment New York State is making to offshore wind. I think that's going to be a tremendous reliability asset that helps get us towards those renewable goals, but does so in a way that it actually contributes to reliability in a much more meaningful way. Most of the solar in New York State today is behind the meter. So that means to the electric system, it just looks like the load is going down during the day, as opposed to actually having a generation resource that we can manage. So utility scale solar, those larger installations, from a grid operations and reliability standpoint, are more valuable because during those times of overproduction where we've actually got too much on the system, that's almost hard to believe because we have so little of it. But as we look into the future, we anticipate there's going to be periods of time when we've got too much of it. We either have to think about having sort of that large scale ability to control the output of it, which means curtail it so that we don't disrupt flow of the power system so we don't damage any of the transmission infrastructure by oversupply. Or we got to start thinking about ways to couple batteries with some of those installations. So we think that the utility scale solar demonstrates a higher degree of reliability contribution than behind the meter. But the good thing about solar is it's much more predictable in terms of the output than the wind output. So we can plan for it and we can manage it. So whether it's behind the meter or whether it's utility scale solar, solar itself, just thinking about the pattern of the sun, is a lot more predictable and easier to manage.